For 3 decades, the English crown was a prize won and lost in the mud. The Wars of the Roses conditioned the nobility to view violence as the primary engine of political transition. When Richard III was hacked to death in 1485, the cycle simply reset. Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth Field delivered a crown, but strategically the triumph was hollow. Winning a single battle against a deeply unpopular king did not grant the victor control over a fractured, militarized nation. Henry VII was an exile with a weak dynastic claim, backed largely by French mercenaries. Worse, he inherited a state exchequer that was effectively bankrupt. He assumed control of a government possessing no capital to enforce its own authority. The immediate threat to his survival was a systemic condition known as bastard feudalism. The English nobility no longer operated as loyal vassals bound by honor. They functioned as regional warlords running autonomous cartels. These warlords maintained massive private armies through a system of indentured retainers, essentially paid mercenaries masquerading as household servants, wearing their lord's badge and enforcing his local monopoly on violence. The math facing the new king was brutally simple. Raising a royal army to physically suppress dozens of regional warlords required massive capital. Henry had none. Military suppression was a mathematical impossibility. Bosworth did not secure the Tudor dynasty. It merely placed a broke, foreign-backed usurper at the center of a kingdom monopolized by heavily armed syndicates. To survive, Henry had to abandon the battlefield entirely. Henry realized that adhering to the traditional model of chivalric kingship was a death sentence. Engaging the nobles on their own terms, through physical force and honor-bound alliances, would lead to his overthrow. He treated the pacification of England as a hostile corporate takeover. His objective was to systematically liquidate the resources of his domestic rivals. This strategy relied on financial pacification. Instead of meeting swords with swords, Henry met swords with ledgers, using the administrative apparatus of the state to drain the capital required to fund those private armies. The metric of power shifted from acreage to liquid assets. The state began aggressively tracking, taxing, and hoarding physical wealth. A lord with vast lands but no silver could not pay retainers, and an unpaid retainer does not rebel. To map these assets, Henry overhauled royal intelligence. He replaced military scouts with regional financial informants, agents whose sole job was to uncover concealed wealth, audit local estates, and report tax evasion directly to the crown. Henry secured his dynasty by out-auditing his rivals. He engineered a centralized intelligence network that identified the aristocracy's wealth, and then he weaponized that very wealth against them. The first legislative strike in this financial war was with strict enforcement of laws against livery and maintenance, the specific legal mechanisms the nobility used to employ their private mercenary armies. When Henry caught a lord violating these laws, he rarely executed him. Dead nobles created martyrs and vengeful heirs. Instead, he levied exorbitant, crushing fines. The economic logic was flawless. A fine achieved 2 things simultaneously. It stripped the offending warlord of the liquid capital needed to pay his soldiers, and it transferred that power directly into the royal treasury. But Henry faced a severe logistical roadblock. Traditional common law courts were cumbersome, slow, and routinely corrupted by local lords. A local jury would not convict their regional warlord. To bypass this, Henry relied heavily on the Court of Star Chamber. Composed of trusted privy councillors, this prerogative court cut through the common law system, acting swiftly and directly on the king's authority to prosecute threats to the state. By bypassing the traditional justice system, the crown established a frictionless mechanism for extracting capital from its political rivals. The legal code became an instrument of financial hemorrhage. The ultimate evolution of this extraction system was established in the year 1495. The council learned in the law. This was the king's debt collection agency, elevated to the highest level of state power. The council learned was terrifying because it bypassed the legal system entirely. It was a tribunal, not a court. It used no jury, permitted no appeal, and answered exclusively to the king's will. Its primary instrument for aristocratic control was a legal device known as bonds and recognizances. This was a formal, written agreement recognizing a massive debt owed to the crown. A noble faced a penal bond for mere suspicion of disloyalty. The massive debt was held in suspension, strictly conditional on absolute obedience. A suspended ledger replaced the sword of Damocles. One misstep and the crown instantly seized all assets, erasing a lineage overnight. Henry mathematically collateralized aristocratic loyalty. Honor and military alliances were secondary to the reality that the crown now owned the nobility's debt. The architects who engineered this extraction were two highly efficient bureaucrats, Sir Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley. Neither were powerful territorial lords. They were aggressive, highly educated lawyers and accountants elevated to the highest rungs of state power, fiercely loyal to the king because their authority derived entirely from him. Empson and Dudley deployed vast networks of informants to scour old property records. They resurrected obscure, long-forgotten feudal obligations and weaponized minor penal statutes to trap the elite in a web of technicalities. This chart shows the macroeconomic result of their campaign. In just 4 years, Empson and Dudley extracted an estimated £200,000 from the English nobility, a volume of capital forcibly relocated from private estates to the royal treasury. The psychological effect on the ruling class was absolute paralysis. Every major family was highly leveraged, terrified that a single unfavorable report to the council learned would trigger their financial obliteration. Empson and Dudley weaponized the legal code to hold the entire English ruling class hostage, achieving total compliance without fielding a single army. Henry VII micromanaged this extraction to an obsessive degree. State records show the king personally verifying and signing off on individual ledger entries, tracking his hoard down to the last halfpenny. But the stress of this continuous paranoid administration eroded his health. The Auditor king died of tuberculosis in his private chambers at Richmond Palace in April 1509. The kingdom he left behind was solvent and centralized, yet brittle. Years of financial extraction had pushed the nobility to a breaking point. Their fear remained absolute, but the tension was unsustainable. The throne passed to his 17-year-old son, Henry VIII. The new king inherited a bursting treasury, but he also inherited the mounting resentment of a ruling class desperate for relief. Henry VIII's first major act of statecraft was to order the immediate arrest of Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley. They were charged with fabricated counts of constructive treason, convicted, and beheaded. Their execution was a calculated blood sacrifice. By offering up his father's enforcers, Henry VIII bought the immediate goodwill of the nobility and released the catastrophic pressure that had built up in the political system. Yet the supreme irony of 1510 was that Empson and Dudley were merely fall guys. Henry VIII executed the accountants, but he kept every ounce of the extracted silver, and he retained the centralized, unchecked executive power they had built. The obsessive usurper had succeeded. Henry VIII replaced the bloody chaos of the medieval battlefield with the quiet, crushing terror of the audit, establishing the fiscal and administrative foundations of the modern English state.